morning, everyone. Welcome to your SCAT TDM deep dive training session. Today, the theme is going to be new mobility. We're very grateful to have all of you around today. We really appreciate the time you're taking. We know everyone has busy days, especially during that time of the year. And we'll take some time today to learn a bit more about new mobility evolution, how that influence and can be influenced by transport demand management. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, so I'm sure we'll have some people still continue to join, but let's start now. And as a reminder, this is the fourth out of 6 deep dive discussions that are part of the SCAT TDM training. During the session, you will have the ability to unmute yourself and share your thoughts verbally. We're also going to ask people to, stay obviously muted during the session where we are discussing, but you can at all time use the chat, and we'll make sure to have Q&A time as appropriate for you to be able to share your experience, feedback, or review. We will also be using for that, as I mentioned, the chat. So make sure that you have the chat box open so you can share your thoughts during the call. All right. We'll start by getting a feel of who is here today. So if you wouldn't mind going into the Zoom chat right now and type 3 info, your name, what organization you're with or representing this morning, and your job title or the type of responsibility you are handling right now. These trainings are really also about networking and promoting TDM initiative and partnership. So if you are interested to add on top of that your emails or your LinkedIn, if not already done, please do so as well, so people can connect with you after the conversation that we'll have today. And in the meantime, I will introduce myself. My name is Alia Verlos. I'm leading the Steer Consultancy in North American New Mobility effort. It has been 3 years now, but I've been in the new mobility sector for the past 10 years, half in Europe, and as you can hear from my French accent, and the other half here in the US. I also work very closely with the TDM team in LA. So Julia Wien and Titi that we have here today. And I'm sure if you are familiar with these training sessions, you've heard their names or have seen them previously. And it's pretty interesting because there's many ways in which TDM and behavioral analysis, as well as new mobility, can merge together. So today, the session is really going to be about learning a bit more about this. I'm joined today by a couple of my colleagues who are going to be helping out and as they've been doing it for the previous session. So as mentioned, there's Julia and Titi here with us, as well as Leslie Scott, who is going to help with the facilitation. And in about an hour from now, I will also be joined by Aurelio Pardo, who will present his work as part of the Urban Movement Labs. But let me pause now. And Leslie, if you wouldn't mind, who do we have with us today at the training?
Thank you, Elliot. It's so good to be here. And I just want to again acknowledge the networking and relationships that we've been developing through these deep dive trainings. So we have some folks who have joined us in some of the other trainings, and that's, let's see, we've got Zachary from LADOT, we've got Matthew from Lancaster. Let's see, we've got the folks from Culver City. I see our friend Melissa from City of Irvine, and Alia and I are working with Warren at OCTA. Let's see, along with, Dr. Rafi from Cal State University of San Bernardino, I believe. And let's see, so those are some of the folks again that we've seen along the way. And and there's Joe popping in from OCTA as well. So I just want to encourage people to continue to use the chat. You'll see in the networking that we've got more colleagues coming on, such as Barbara from City of Santa Monica. And those are just to name a few. So a great group of people representing both cities as well as universities. And we're seeing a great representation for geography. As I've mentioned, we have Orange County, Los Angeles County, Ventura County, San Bernardino, and Riverside County, all very, very well represented. So we welcome you today and are really enthusiastic for an interesting dialogue about new mobility. And I will emphasize again that I'll be moderating the chat. So please put your comments in the chat. And what I'll be doing is collecting the themes that will see the themes and the patterns, and then we'll have some open discussion. So thank you again, and back to the team.
That's great. Thank you, Leslie. And thank you all again for being with us today. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Steve from SCAG to give us an update on what's going on the STEP front. Steve, please feel free to go ahead.
Thanks, Aaliyah. Good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Fox, Project Manager of the TDM Training Sessions and TDM program here at SCAG. For those of you not familiar with SCAG, we're the largest metropolitan planning organization in the nation in terms of both population and land area, representing the 6 counties that you see there on the PowerPoint. One of the main things that we do is every 4 years, our regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategy. The last one that was adopted was in 2020, and the next one will be in 2024. Next slide. So back in 2019, we adopted a TDM strategic plan for the region, and that has been incorporated into our 2020 Connect SoCal RTP plan. And it was a very comprehensive effort, and it was the first time that we had done it. And among other things, it came up with a toolbox of strategies, of TDM toolbox strategies, 32 altogether in different categories. It also had 17 specific strategies and recommendations to implement and further TDM in the SCAG region. And these training sessions are one of those recommendations. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's on the SCAG website under Plans and Programs /transportation/TDM. Next slide, please. SCAG also has several new mobility efforts currently underway, 4 of them to be specific. One's mobility as a service feasibility study, which we're in the middle of right now, and with our partners, our many stakeholders in the region. We're just looking at issues, building blocks, challenges, and opportunities on how to advance mobility as a service in the region. We're also involved in a curb space management study, engaging with 4 cities to understand curb space management in terms of goods movement, transportation network companies such as Lyft and Uber, bus stops, pedestrian complete streets, all that stuff. Another big program we have funding projects, the Sustainable Communities Program Call 3, specifically smart cities and mobility innovations. Category 8 projects, again, looking at curb space management, technology adoption, parking management. And then finally, the Future Communities Pilot Program. We got funding through the AQMD's Mobile Source Air Pollution Reduction Review Committee. And we funded 8 pilot projects with cities in the region on how to apply technology and data analytics to reduce BMTs, local travel and congestion, with specific city municipal operations that are provided at the city level. Next slide. And here are a list of the deep dive sessions. This is the 4th one. We had done 3 previously. If you would like to watch those, they are on the TDM website, which I mentioned earlier. A couple still need to be posted, especially the last one. And then you can see there number 5 and number 6 coming up in May. TDM strategies for suburban and rural communities. And then the last one, TDM metrics and monitoring. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Aaliyah.
Thank you so much, Steve. And so this morning, we're going to cover several topics. And from just looking at the inscription list that was shared with me by the team, I was able to see that a majority of you had limited to moderate knowledge on what is new mobility. So we'll start our journey today by looking at the current new mobility landscape and the current trends and how these trends are evolving. We will then explore what shapes new mobility, and I will pause here and discuss a bit more about mobility hubs, as I know this is a key trending topic right now. And I know from hearing Leslie that we have some folks here that might be able also to share some inputs on how their strategy or implementation of mobility apps are going on. We'll then obviously see where do new mobility and TDM join, as this is the key of joining these two main themes together. We'll have obviously a break to refill a cup of coffee and tea or water. And we'll then deep dive into how to combine new mobility into TDM program. And we'll have the second use case, I would say, so the Urban Movement Lab ones. We'll finish with final Q&A, but as I mentioned earlier, I will stop across the entire presentation so we have time to pause, hear your feedback, have discussion about what we've just been discussing. So let's try to make that a dynamic conversation today, not a monologue where you'll hear me a lot. All right, and let's just start with this actually. This first question I would like to ask the audience. What are you, in a few words, hope to learn today? It'll be great if you could add your comments in the chat if there's anything that you hope to learn today that we should be aware of. Could be one or two ideas that you really want us to touch on or learn today. Make sure you add your ideas, and Leslie will gather them and we'll make sure to answer or to cover them, hopefully, by the end of the training today. So what is new mobility? Without further ado, let's start talking about it. And when we say new mobility, sometimes I also hear emerging mobility. Sometimes people say disruptive technology. It's a buzzword, we know about it, and it's going to be important for us to break down what are the key trends within the market and what does it matter to talk about it. But I always like to start with this small videos, because I feel like when I talk to my family, my friends, or some of my colleagues sometimes about what I do, that sometimes is the image they have in mind, which from a congestion point of view would not be so much a good thing when you think about it. I would love to know what comes to your mind when you think about new mobility. So on top of adding type of topic you'd like us to cover today, I would absolutely love for you to also let us know about one word, not for you, describe new mobility or is adjacent to new mobility. What would that be? Please go ahead and type these words into the chat box as well right now. So why are we interested to look at the future and the future of mobility more specifically? Our mobility system today is quite impressive when you think about it. You have so many options to get around. You can walk, you can bike, you can use a scooter for short distance. You can get on a bus, a ferry, a light rail, a train, a streetcar. You can drive your own car or be driven by a car. You can hail a ride, reserve a car share, join a carpool, or fly. You can even try, some new pilot autonomous shuttles. And I'm pretty sure some of you might have seen some sideway robots or drones that are sometimes delivering food, or most of the time are just in the pilot stage. But with all of that comes also a lot of challenges that we face. And when we think about the future and the future of mobility, we start, first of all, to start thinking about these challenges. And first and foremost, I think, and it's probably going to be obvious for some of you, the world is growing in terms of population. More people moving to the middle class, which increase the appetite for mobility and the demand for mobility as well. What's also growing is the demand for energy to support the different transportation system that we have around the world. I think we can also recognize that there is, of course, congestion in our cities, of course, here in California, but, in a lot of cities across the world as well. And as the world continues to grow with urbanization of our cities, there's also new challenges that increase dramatically with it. Obviously, no one is new to the fact that transportation systems are a major contributor to air pollution and CO2 emission, and therefore climate change. And when you think about the future, and when we do that as practitioners, we think about how, as a society, we are responding to, on one side, the increase of demand for mobility, while simultaneously, hard word to pronounce in French and in English, while in the same time addressing the energy and environmental concern. And as you can see in this iceberg of what is the future and what is, the key consideration and trends that we need to think about, there's also technology and services. And they're really at the bottom for me because, yes, they can affect the way in which we travel, but they do that both in a positive and sometimes negative ways. They're really an enabler, or they can also constrain. With all of that, there's also policies. There's policies, at the city, at the state, national, international levels, which try to address the issues that we mentioned earlier: climate change, pollution, congestion, and so on. And the future is very uncertain, and that's definitely something that we always have to keep in mind, especially when we think about new mobility. It's a very fast changing market. There is different driven forces that affect the mobility system, and the way we look at the future and the future landscape from today and the reality that we live in right now could be very different from the expectation that we have in a few years and the reality, or the diverse scenarios that are possible for the future. So there's a lot of things when people ask me about what's the future of mobility, where thinking in terms of scenarios sometimes makes more sense, because you want to factor in risk associated to the uncertainty that this market represent. But going back to the definition, usually when we think about new mobility, there's two main themes we think about. There is, on one side, new business models and social trends, and on the other side, new technology and services. New mobility really refers to emerging elements of our transportation system that are enabled by digital technologies, shared, driven, and real-time data, and more increasingly connected and automated services. So often when we talk about new mobility, people tend to refer mostly to the new tech side of things, but I think it's important as well to keep in mind that what comes new is also the business models and the social trends that go with it. So on the first side of it, when we talk about new business model and new social trends, when we go around, we can now, as I mentioned, choose a rideshare app, a Uber, a Lyft, or even a taxi app. We can also use a car share service. Zipcar is a good example. Turo is another example. You can arrange to join a carpool, or you can, sit with a stranger on a shared van. Free floating bike share or e-scooter service also allows people to pick up and drop off shared vehicle over a city. These are examples of shared modes that we take into account when we think about shared mobility. Some technology expand our options even more, and they offer an on-demand services. I probably have seen some on-demand shuttles or microtransits in the streets. Mobility hubs, and we'll go back on mobility hubs, but they can host multiple options together in one location, and one of their goals is to ease transfer. So we are seeing also these type of new services and new type of way to think about mobility and integration of mobility emerging as well. These new emerging services, they also enabled by obviously internet, the mobile data, smartphone that are in our pockets, and mobile apps more and more help us to find the best driving routes, to make sure that we catch our bus, that we can find the right shared bikes, to be able to ride on a hilly road. It's important also to think about new mobility from a digital point of view and the integration that goes with it. And that's what the MaaS approach, mobility as a service approach, is here for. It's a layering of integration from helping you to plan your trip up to an integration of fare, if we look at it from that point of view. New technology and services on the other side. Obviously, we have in mind that most of these new services tend to be electric, or, well, most of them tend to be electric. So that's one of the key trends that is going to also be quite important when we think about the new mobility landscape. And as I mentioned, more and more these services try to be connected and try to be automated. So these are also elements that we want to think about when we think about new mobility. I'm going to post that because these are keywords that we're going to use across this training today. Leslie, is there any question, feedback that I should be aware of? Or anyone, if you want to.
I would like to again acknowledge our group here, and it does look like a lot of people have a good idea of sort of the definitions and trends that you've just explained. And we do have, let's see, Barbara from Santa Monica emphasizing, like you said, that say the many options that are on the left of the screen. And yet we also have specifics that were given. For example, Bryce from Torrance is talking about things that are on demand. And Dr. Raffi from Cal State University of San Bernardino has mentioned, as you said, the social aspects of equity. So our participants are really, involved with some of the definitions. And then Joe from OCTA is also saying, yeah, and it's a buzzword, and what does that really mean? So I think that's a good transition for how we're going to dive deeper into what does that really mean.
Absolutely. And I think seeing like these keywords together, and as I mentioned, the tech side, the business side is quite important when you think about this market. So let's keep that in mind. Great to hear that we have participants that have and will have, I'm sure, some example and question to ask about this later on. So I think when you start thinking about new mobility, you need to think about it as an ecosystem. And this is where things start to get a bit tricky. As mentioned, it's a fast changing industry. It's also an industry in which there is a lot of interconnection between different groups of stakeholders. This is a graphic I found on a McKinsey website, probably not the best, but enough to show you the complexity of certain network when you think about new mobility. Obviously, you have different type of actors that are the traditional one, the public sector, so government from city to, well, I guess, international organization. You also have key private sector, the providers, as you would imagine, as part of that ecosystem. But around it, there is a lot of other organizations that might have an impact on how you think about the different services that you'll see in your street or you're planning to have in your street and how they interact with each other, especially as we think about more new mobility as a way to integrate more modes together. And just to list some of them, obviously the infrastructure provider is going to be a key stakeholders, especially as we go toward more connected futures. And so connected infrastructure to be able to connect with the vehicles is going to be key. Utilities company is going to be also key, especially as we think about a future that with electrification of fleets and what would be the impact in our different territories. There is obviously people, and with that I mean the CBOs, but also mean social movements. These new services sometimes, and probably you've heard about the word gig economy, can have very negative impact that the society is currently looking at as well. And there is really strong view, especially for, not for all of them, but when you think about ride-hailing, Uber, Lyft, I'm sure you've heard or you've seen a lot of strong pieces, articles on these topics. So these are also important. We also need to look at it from a business point of view, right? Because some of these new services are helping local businesses. The IT structure is definitely something we want to keep in mind, system suppliers, and obviously like OEMs that are working with all of this. So it's a very complex ecosystem and it's an evolving ecosystem. And when you start looking at a project that involves new mobility, it is something that you always have to start with mapping the ecosystem to understand who you're going to be involved with. I want to pause here because Leslie, I know you mentioned like some people having keywords to define new mobility. I want to know if there is anything else that people have added, especially related to the ecosystem.
Well, let's see. So relating to the ecosystem, we have Jill commenting about just in general the idea of innovative mobility, right? And let's see, like we said, Gerald from Cal State is also saying that, you know, there's this network of opportunity. So I think those are words that have been added. And I had mentioned already Barbara saying options and Dr. Rafferty talking about the equity perspective. So those are keywords, and yet also we have some specific examples of scooters and let's see, again, the word for electrification. And just now, Warren from OCTA is giving us a specific comment here, and his statement here is how to ensure mobility addresses equity and supports public investments such as transit. And we know that we've worked together, the three of us, and we've seen this issue come up in OCTA when we've talked to the stakeholders. Again, this idea of new mobility, addressing equity, and supporting the public investments such as transit. So if you want to add a little to that comment, I think it will be helpful for the group.
Absolutely. And I think some of the section later on are going also to touch base specifically on that as we go, you know, from what is the new mobility into how does it combine with TDM. But you're absolutely right. As a starting point, I started working in new mobility 10 years ago. And from the beginning, what we realized when we were doing user surveys on car share users, at the time, micromobility was just called bike share. So on the bike share users, in Europe was that the type of users that were using these new modes were the type of like pioneer 30 plus male active with good income. And for years, that picture has not changed. And you could add a new mode, it will still remain with the same pictures in terms of who are using them. That changed, I would say, a few years ago when now that there is some key trends that seem to stay, and most that seem to also stay within our cities, the local authorities have started rethinking about how to integrate new mobility into their planning effort and rethinking about how they want some of their project to look like. I think what I find really interesting is most of the time when you see a new mobility strategy or project, the KPIs associated to it and how these KPIs can integrate equity or ensure that, you know, equity goals that a city might have reach to ensure that the private sector comply to them. We'll go back on that, but it's definitely a key trend now. First of all, to talk about equity in transportation in general, but in action to see how it is being done is something we can discuss, you know, across the training.
Great, thank you. I think that's it for our comments. And again, we encourage everybody to keep putting their thoughts in the chat. If there's something that's not clear as we go through the new modes, let me know. And again, I'll curate those questions and we'll have a little bit bantering back and forth. So thank you. And let's see what these new modes look like.
Thank you, Leslie. I appreciate that. So you've seen that the landscape of new mobility is a bit complex. The evolution, meaning the recent evolution of it, is also something that we need to touch base on when we think about new mobility. So new modes, obviously some you've already heard about because new can be old, right? Bike share system exists since the 60s in Europe. And what is new about them is the technology that is now integrated to them, the fact that we have electric bikes that are shared. E-scooters obviously is probably one of the most recent modes that has been developed in our countries. Same thing, it's not new per se. It's the system, the business model system that is used and how people are using it that has changed over time. So more and more people are choosing shared mobility services to get around cities. It's still a niche market, but I would say that definitely we are seeing increased use and shared mobility is not necessarily something that's going to completely replace, a transit trip or a car trip, but it's not to expand the spectrum of option that someone might have when they want to go around. Obviously, there's a lot of constraint depending on where you are and who you are, but as a general trend, this is something we're seeing. Shared mobility includes obviously public and private transportation services. It's important. Certain shared mobility services are seen as public service. It's often the case with bike share. Others are seen as just complementary type of service, and therefore not or less seen as a public service per se. And there's an increased granularity in the choice of transport mode that we have. It also goes with the idea that more and more people are turning from owning to sharing attitude. And we've seen that across the time. The most recent word I've heard to describe this, it's a million words, is no ownership in one word, which is basically the decision not to own any material stuff, including transportation vehicles, and also reflecting in preferring pay-per services instead of owning an object. And obviously, it has an impact in transportation, but you can also see that in people renting their furniture in their apartment, things like that. So we have also, as I mentioned, new business models that are emerging, such as those based on data monetization, platform users fee, pay-per-mile payment scheme, as opposed to the traditional pay-per-unit model that we used to have. COVID has impacted all of that in a very diverse way for the new mobility sector. As an example, macro-mobility really rise with some services seeing the most impressive ridership increase during COVID. Obviously, they also changed the way the fare integration was integrated with free discount or membership for small businesses or essential workers. I'm sure you've heard also about on the contrary, what happened to ride-hailing that suffered a dramatic usage decline. Uber and Lyft had to suspend pool rides for a time due to, obviously, risk related to COVID-19 transmission. And what we've seen is that this sector is very agile, very flexible, and can completely change their focus and repurpose their use. And I think COVID-19 really showed us that how disruptive the sector can be. One thing that we've seen continuing, and obviously again here, this is something that probably you've seen more specifically being in California, but I think it's a national and an international trend, is the electrification of fleets is now. On a COVID-19 perspective, what was really impressive is the increase of e-bike sales across the nation, shared or owned. But more generally, what is really interesting here is that the continuous electrification of fleet, with obviously the support from the Biden administration and the bipartisan infrastructure law, is really currently making this market really booming as of now, and creating, I think we are probably in a really ideal condition right now to see this market booming. There is constraint to that, especially related to charging, but it is one of the key trends. Another one is, and I like to refer that as information is the new infrastructure. Increasingly, I would say, infrastructure is becoming virtual. There's sensors, there's control system everywhere that manage flows and movement and data that we collect to use and improve our travel options. The new information related to these infrastructure includes bike and ped counters, traffic signal control, smooth motion, traffic flow, system that basically tell us if our bus and train is running on time, if we'll be able to rent this bike that we want. And it's really like a new world of internet connected sensor that track vehicle speed and drivers' behaviors, or ride-hailing app that track our routes and determine the fare. I think from a practitioner point of view, it's also new data that we're using to help us understand how to switch a policy or a plan, or how to analyze users' ridership. Automation is coming. This one I'm sure you had in mind as well. The current question right now is not about, is AV going or should be or should not be implemented. they're already with us. And if you just look at California, there's at least 50 different companies that currently have a permit to test AV on the road in the state itself. When we talk about AV right now, the focus of the industry in the past couple of years has been more related to how would these evolving transportation system impact our society? What's going to be the impact on social world, like workforce, for example, labor? What's going to be the impact on people who will live within systems that are semi or totally automated, and whether we will keep or not some direct human control on them. Obviously, COVID has also had an impact on this industry, and we've seen a lot of pilots accelerating. One that I like to mention is the Neuro one. It's the picture you're seeing here on the screen. This is a little small car that is doing AV delivery. And obviously during COVID has been used to deliver medical supplies or foods across the perimeter where they are allowed to drive. This car doesn't have any human controlling it. It's the first AV tech that is not required to have a safety drivers in front of a wheel. The downside of it is obviously, I don't know if you heard, I think it was a week ago, there's been a story about a cruise AV that was arrested by a policeman and that just went away. We will have to interact in a different way with autonomous vehicle, and there's a lot to learn and a lot to write about this. Where is that going? Are we going towards smart cities? What does it mean? So the term smart cities can be used in a different way by different people. For most, it can be related to tech advanced metropolis, where citizens rely on smart gadgets for their daily life. For others, and this is a key trend that has emerged in the past 2 years or so, there's more and more a consideration toward how can technology be used to improve quality of life of people, residents, and what to do with it. And I wanted to show you here in this slide an example of 15-minute cities. So the concept of 15-minute cities is and are strategies that a city can implement to focus on improving people's, resident, I would say, life, making the city more accessible to everyone. And there is some apps that are looking for you if you live in a 15-minute city. So I tried that yesterday and I checked LA to see what was the result of that. Apparently, LA downtown meet the criteria for a 15-minute city. How surprising! I'll be curious to see if on the next TDM session you guys are going to have, we see the same thing about rural and suburban areas. But these are new tools that can be used as well, and I think are quite fascinating. I'm going to pause here, Leslie. Is there any comments? Is there any feedback or reflection?
So for now, let's see, I put in the chat, what is a new mode or a new about a mode? And let's see, waiting for some comments, but I do want to acknowledge that we do have some people from, let's see, Torrance Transit and LA World Airports. And just from our experience in the area, for any of the transit agencies, we do know that they are looking at new mobility, and the whole idea of a all-electric fleet falls within that new mobility. So I wanted to pitch that to you to comment a little bit about that while we let some more comments come in about new mobility in general. So do you want to, again, say something about the fact that I know in our region, LA Metro, we mentioned Torrance Transit has been online with us, as well as OCT is online, and everybody is changing their fleets to electric because of a regulation and how that has impacted some of the service, as you mentioned. How does a mode become new because of the way it services?
Yeah, it is very interesting. So thank you, Leslie. So key point on here. When does a mode become new? It's almost a philosophical question. What we know about it is, for shared mobility, as an example, the vehicle that we use within shared mobility, a car or a bike or a scooter per se, are not new. What is new about them is the fact that instead of owning them, you share them. And it's the business model around how this works and how this is integrated as part of the solution that you can use when you are in a city to travel around. That is new. And what is evolving in this is how, as an individual, you'll be able to more and more integrate the different solutions together. So you'll have, with a MaaS approach, you can have one app with 5 or 6 different modes accessible, where you don't have to don't have to download a million apps. You don't have to know exactly what's the fare for each of them, and you can circulate around with them. That's what the alternative start to look like. What is new as well in these is the integration of equity approach, because for a long time, as I mentioned, it was new. So most of the people that were using it, and there's a huge gender gap here, were male, middle class and above, etc. What has changed now is for the private sector to consider that they need to integrate more proactively equity plan within their services. They've been pushed by the public sector to do that, to make sure that not only the new modes are making your journey, an option increase, but also that it is accessible for everyone. The last step that this industry is starting to think about right now, and it's still at the very beginning of it, is, and we'll talk about that, is the ADA compliance. For some, because it's just really hard, when you have a bicycle, to adapt it or to have enough, enough demand to have a shared ADA bike. But I know Lime is doing currently some new service around that, and RFPs are now requiring for some tender to have that. But I think the industry is starting to looking at it, but it's still not really where they should be as of now. Related to, and I will just, this is actually a good segue to shaping new mobility, but related to airports and how new mobility can integrate airports, I think there's a lot of consideration currently, as I've heard, related to parking, revenue stream related to parking, and how new mobility can interact with that. And there's different ways to see it. The first one is smart parking and using real-time information to be able to update the user experience. And obviously within the parking, adding more charging station. This is going to be key, knowing that ride-hailing are going to turn completely electric soon, and therefore the need to have electric charging spot at the station, at the airport, is going to be key. Another way, and another key trends in the airport industry related to new mobility is AV, right? Autonomous vehicle. And one of the reasons for it is it's a closed environment. So autonomous vehicle trials are sometimes a bit easier, and there's a lot of use cases to use autonomous shuttles, or I've seen also like autonomous luggage. You can have a lot of things to ease and transform in a more efficient way the journey, and from a staff perspective, the work with an airport. As you can hear, there's a lot of benefits and goals that new mobility have, from having a shared electric mobility offer that is more ecological, offering alternative to owning a car, reducing the automobile dependency, and with that, obviously, noise pollution, congestion, emission, triggering multimodality, meaning the ability to use different modes and not be stuck in an habit to use car, for example, and freeing with that space, because reducing parking to help rethink about our space and what it means to be in a public space. But there's also a lot of challenges that we should absolutely have in mind when we think as practitioners to these new modes and how they integrate with us. And I've listed some that I have encountered a lot, or I've heard cities encounter a lot when partnering with private sector. The first one is ambitious project design that result in delays, rescoping, downsizing of project. That's very often common that the private sector sometimes think a bit too big and not think enough about that ecosystem that exists and constraint that exists. And there's a lot of project or pilot that don't go or don't scale up because of that. Contracting challenges related to who own, manage, operate the different mobility services over time, and from a public sector point of view, what is the level of responsibility that they have? And related to that, data agreement, obviously, privacy and ownership. is some challenges that we've heard a lot in the recent years. Obviously, changing business model. Some of these new technologies only works well in very dense areas. So when you start adding to that an equity approach, and they have to go, a bit more in the rural or suburban area where there's less demand, very often comes an issue of finance and funding and the limits of that. This is going to be very key as we are going away from the gas tax, and we need to rethink about what are the different funding mechanisms that exist that is going to be able to sustain and finance shared mobility or just new mobility services in general if we want. And I think something that was mentioned and discussed also with the SCAC team that I think is important and I touch base really quickly on is the adherence to state federal requirements, and more specifically, as I was saying, the ADA requirements are sometimes very difficult for the private industry to start thinking of, but they have to, and how that can sometimes create some challenges as well. Pausing here for a sec. Leslie, is there any comments?
Yeah, so a lot of what you were saying was integrating some of the answers to the comments we have. And so I'll just reiterate some of the questions. And although you have answered them, again, let's just open it up if you want to add anything. And one of those, again, is this idea that you talked about when I started to say, okay, so we know that transit is shifting to electric. And then you mentioned a lot of the other mobilities, whether it is bike share, whether it is scooters, as well as just this whole data and mobility as a service. And Dr. Raffi's big question is how to shift the car society to new modes of mobility in Southern California, as well as I want to acknowledge Bryce's comment, which is somewhat related. So we have this idea of shifting the car society and also shifting renting and owning, and which is more either an economic trend, or is it something that we're actually going to be seen as something more permanent in the ability to, again, our big question with TDM, right, is the whole idea that we're shifting trips from car trips to other trips. So those are lots of different ways of saying the same thing, but really it comes down to what could be our next transition, which is a little bit of how this relates to TDM.
And it's a really difficult question to answer, isn't it? And I think increasingly considering new mobility within TDM strategies is maybe part of an answer. So I'll keep that question in my mind and we'll answer to it while we go through that. So thank you so much for sharing this. I think this is what we all are very passionate about, and at the end of the day, why we work in this field together. One way to talk about this by an illustration of how can we switch behavior habits, and that seems really promising, and a lot of people are working on, I think, is the concept of mobility hubs. It's really a concept that has evolved over time from being, transfer hub, public transportation installation, to now be more considered as a location where you have different type of options that are integrated within a connected system and within a digital and sometimes a fare level. And I wanted to pause a little on that to show you, what it is and how it works. It's, as I said, an important concept that has been evolved over time. And the best way to sort of illustrate what is within it is mobility hubs really allow people to easily switch between the different transport services and modes. Some we've been discussing about, some that are just the traditional one, the bus, the train. They are connected facilities that have very specific wayfinding that needs to be compliant to the ADA access, that are scaled and designed to be flexible and adaptable to the local community's needs and create a sense of place. And this is an example, obviously just an illustration of what could a mobility hub look like. And you see there's car share, there is some wayfinding in the middle, someone can grab a coffee. There's obviously the bus, that is the backbone of what the mobility hub is around. Some people could use lockers as well. And some of the benefits related to it or associated to it is the goal of improving accessibility for individual with limited transport choice or no access to car, is the idea to increase transit ridership and transit flow via the integration of first and last mile services. It is also a sustainability goal to provide opportunities to reduce car dependency by encouraging use of sustainable modes like micromobility and a more livable place. And they exist obviously today in our region, although the first example is not in California, but I wanted to mention three example, but quickly, of mobility apps pilot that are currently in the US. The first one is the Minneapolis one. They opened a 25 mobility app pilot across the city with very, as you can see, very agile design, right? It's quite pop blue. Blue seems to be a color that a lot of people like. Clear branding, logo, location, and this is where equity goes into it. Location is being specifically thought to be in disadvantaged communities areas. They also have, as part of the pilot, community ambassador that speak different language and are helping people to try the new modes or to help them think about the journey with the new modes. The example you have in the middle is LADOT. It's the Wilshire Ground Mobility Hub that begins with obviously the LADOT 3 years pilot program to develop, I think isn't it around almost 100 mobility hubs. And this is, I believe, the first location or one of the first location for these new mobility hubs that will have, I don't know if it's open or not because during COVID, I know it paused for a time, but we'll be equipped of, secure private access room, bike parking, micromobility charging, bike repairs, personal trip planning, and real-time transit departure. The last example is one that I think and really appreciate is, and I think picture is not the right one, but that's okay. It's the Caltrain SF bike. Yes, definitely not the right picture. Station that is a standalone building adjacent to the San Francisco station entryway, has been in operation for a very long time and is now has just now retrofit into a mobility hub station that integrate both bike facilities and micromobility valets and park and charge pilot program. So these are examples that I wanted to share of actual mobility apps. I will continue because I know we are going to stop very soon to get every one of you a break. But I wanted to, actually, maybe we should have a break now, considering that it's almost been an hour of exchange. What about we having a break now, Leslie, team? Is that okay with everyone?
Yes, and I just want to mention while everyone's taking a break that we do have a link for the 15-minute city, which was asked by Barbara from the city of Santa Monica. And thank you, Warren from OCTA, for adding that into the chat. So if anybody is interested in looking at the 15-minute city map, the link is in the chat.
Thank you so much. So everyone, I think we can have a 5-minute breaks and let's reconvene, or 4 minutes. Let's reconvene in 4 or 5 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. hopefully everyone is back with a refill of coffee or some water. And I want to be mindful of everyone's time, so I think we are going to continue. Hello, Leslie. Hello back. All right. So I have kept in my mind some question related, obviously, to car society and how new mobility can help, and hopefully the example of mobility app, on which we can discuss a bit more later during the Q&A, is an example of how, you need to break down a problem when it's too big. So one of the solutions that you can think about when you think about how to switch the society into being less car dependent. But I think one of the key questions that was asked to me when preparing this training of obviously today is, where do TDM and new mobility join? And you probably have seen, if you've been in our SCAT training previously, what is on the left side. And as TDM practitioner, of course, you are pretty much aware of what I'm going to say right now. But as a reminder for those who are not in the TDM world, the transport demand management world, when we talk about TDM, we obviously are referring to strategies that inform and encourage travelers to maximize their transportation efficiency, reduce congestion, lower emission, and we seek to reduce the demand for travel by reducing the total amount of trips, obviously, consolidating numbers of trips, shifting trips to different modes. And after hearing me for 1 hour, I'm sure that these keywords now have some kind of like connection with what new mobility and new mobility service are also trying to do, right? Anything that is not driving by yourself is an alternative mode, and new mobility services participate to this, as those modes are typically more efficient and sustainable. New mobility provide, in a certain way, new option that TDM practitioner can use to encourage people to use alternative modes. They've just increased the options that we can use when we think about how to help people think about the journey. And we know how hard it is, because sometimes, obviously, car and car society are built in a certain way that going from one point A to point B is sometimes just more easy with a car. I think what new mobility brings to the traditional mode is this first last mile, well, going, not necessarily completely seamless, but going towards seamless way to do that, to replace car use in a way that is efficient, because that's what people are looking for, right? People want efficiency. And so when you think about TDM strategies and program, same thing here. You probably have seen this toolbox before, but I want to use it and think about it from a new mobility perspective. There's different tools that you can use. There is education and marketing, incentive and facilitation, infrastructure system upgrades, support policies. Each of these tools has a different cost, has different impact, and are led by different organizations. But if we need to summarize it in a few words, education and marketing, we're thinking about strategies that encourage people to use alternative transportation option by educating them to use the new option. Because sometimes new mobility is actually new for some people. And it's about helping them trying the option by either training or providing incentive for them to try new modes. Incentive and facilitation, therefore, is quite key as well, as these strategies can basically help distribute information about the new transportation option and provide, as I mentioned, direct or indirect incentive to use them. It could go through subsidies to using a specific mode, or it could be through, I guess, like rebate program. This is something that we've seen as well, to basically help people increase access and experience with these modes. And it's really linked to the training as well, right? Because you want to understand how and where to use certain modes. I know that we all have in mind e-scooters and how messy their arrival was in all of our cities a few years ago. And it's still messy in some cities, but I think there's been a huge improvement on how people are using their e-scooters in cities where they are allowed. We could discuss that. Infrastructure and system upgrades, that's obviously is way more expensive. obviously slower, and not everyone has the key responsibility of being able to finance or implement infrastructure updates. Mobility Up will pertain into this in a certain way, as there is infrastructure updates that could be necessary to integrate the different modes together. It's really about the physical improvements, but also the policies and system improvements that goes with it. And the TDM supportive policies, well, there's a lot of adjacent policies that help TDM and could also help new mobility being integrated in them. They can impact land use, price, congestion, and they can be included also in TDM formal process. So when you're required to have a TDM program as part of being large employers, I'm thinking about the airport here, and so on. So that's a lot of tools, and I think when you think about from scratch where to start, there's a handful of questions that you can ask yourself to start helping you shaping how new mobility strategies can be integrated. The first question is, what are your goals? And you can actually spend more time than you think on that first question, because sometimes there's some paradox in the different goals that we might have between equity, efficiency, improving local business access, etc. So having a fair amount of time thinking about what are the objectives we're trying to achieve is important. What are the existing new mobility options in your areas? We start with that. It's way easier to integrate existing options that are working for you, and then think about how you can integrate new ones. Who are the potential users and what are their needs is going to be key, especially when we have equity in our mind. Understanding what is the potential demand is going to help both public and private sector, I guess, to understand the viability and the resilience of the shared modes, because that's a risk as well, right? We know we have example of some places where a new service arrives, stay for a few months, then disappear. And some people were counting on it and now it's not there anymore. So understanding people needs is key. Who are the stakeholders you can work with, from obviously the providers that we mentioned, but all the other stakeholders that we discussed a bit earlier that are part of that ecosystem, and how and at what time you want to integrate them into the conversation. What you don't want to have, which is something that happened to the city of Paris a long time ago when they were updating their bike share service. They realized that the connection between the station that now had to have, that need to be electrified, if you like, to charge the electric bike, were not well connected to the electric system. And they didn't include the utilities company ahead of time to discuss any technical issues. What happened is that for months in Paris, which is one of the cities that use bike share the most, you couldn't access any station. So you couldn't use bike share until they figure out a solution. So stakeholders, really important. Cost, funding constraint. This could be an entire training just on that. And I know probably you have a lot of questions about this, but obviously assessing what is the funding part you can use, or if not, what type of business model you're comfortable with, if it's a public-private sector type of engagement you can have is going to be important. And the last one, but it should be across all the key question, but it's always good to have it separate in case it's not, is thinking about the impact, but mostly thinking about the equity impact of what you're trying to create. What we will do, and this is something we will provide at the end of the session, is we'll provide you with a worksheet that has some of this question in, and that you can work on and fill up to as an at-home exercise, thinking about your own organization, territory, and sort of like helping you to think about how to start integrating new mobility strategies into your consideration. I would like now to hand over to Rogelio. I think you're with us.
Yes, I'm with y'all.
Hello.
Thank you very much. And I'm noticing a typo that's supposed to read project overviews, so apologies for that.
No worries. What about we start? And I'm going to see if I can hand over the slide deck to you so you can move around. But in the meantime, I might start with the first slide. So
Thank you so much, Leah. So folks, thank you so much for giving me some time. I see that there's 20 minutes left, so I'll make sure to be a little speedy through our presentation. And Ali, am I saying your name correctly? I want to make sure I'm getting that right.
I think you should be able, could you check if you can move the slide? I think it should be possible now.
Yes, got it.
Great.
Okay, great. So my name is Rogelio Pardo. I'm with Urban Movements. We're a nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles that is focused on facilitating pilot projects between public agencies and private mobility technologies. Leah mentioned that scooters, when they first showed up a couple years ago, created a lot, some chaos in cities, and some cities are still seeing that chaos. And in response to that chaos, the mayor's office incubated Urban Movement Labs as an opportunity to find a way to facilitate pilot projects in a more collaborative fashion between public agencies and private partners. So that instead of private partners kind of rushing to get ahead of things and focusing on asking for forgiveness rather than permission, we can have a collaborative approach, learn how we can improve the service offerings that startup companies think will help address challenges in the mobility space, and in some instances, actually develop new offerings for them. So there's three key challenges that we try to solve through our pilot projects and our conversations. The first one is that public agencies have limited resources and are fairly busy keeping up with day-to-day demands. So we provide assistance and additional bandwidth to help provide education and understanding of what new technologies are out there and what that means for local agencies. Companies often don't know how to tackle public agencies or how to work in the public space. So we work with them to, again, inform them on how permitting processes work, how a pilot project might be applicable in a community, and really help them think more thoughtfully about how their technology can be deployed to solve existing challenges. Oftentimes, technologies can come to market and they're sort of solutions looking for a problem to solve. So we kind of help them reset and figure out, what does the technology do? What is the potential? What is the envisioned solution? And how can we refine it? And lastly, when scooters first showed up in LA, they kind of ended up everywhere, sometimes chucked into streets, into trash cans, or putting the birds up in the tree. So we're also working through our pilot projects to engage with community members in the areas where we're piloting to ensure that community members have the opportunity to interact with these new technologies, provide feedback, and understand how they may or may not improve their mobility. So I think for today, I'm going to just run through about half a dozen of our pilot projects. Most of these pilot projects are here in Los Angeles, but we are certainly looking to expand our footprint to the broader Los Angeles region. As I mentioned, the organization was spun out of the mayor's office in early 2019, became a separate organization at the end of 2020, and we have I'm one of 5 staffers with the organization, and we've been together for just about a year. So a lot of these projects are pretty fresh to us. The first one I want to talk to is the Warner Center Transportation Technology Innovation Zone. This designation was developed was really spearheaded by our board members. Our board members engaged with Councilmember Blumenfeld, who really saw the Warner Center in the pre-pandemic times as an area that really dealt with congestion, a large commercial center where people drove in or out during peak commute times, but didn't have a lot of options to help people move around, be it for lunch or otherwise. The organization brought together or facilitated a workshop that brought together about 35 different stakeholders, which included elected officials, different agency different agency representatives and community members. They worked together to identify a couple of key challenges that would be opportunities for technology partners to workshop or help bring pilot projects to test solutions to see if they would tackle the challenges that were identified of limited mobility, limited options to getting lunch for workers, and limited connectivity to and from transit. Unfortunately, shortly after this workshop, the pandemic hit. So while we have been able to pilot some efforts in the Warner Center, there have been several, we're still waiting for there to be a critical mass of employees back at the Warner Center to really test some of the more teeny challenges. We've also been working with a pair of personal delivery device companies. The device that you see on the screen right now is called Kiwibot. In my opinion, they're among the cuter personal delivery devices in the market at the moment. We work with two different companies. We work with a company named Tortoise to develop, or rather to test different operations models. The different operations models that they tested were kind of a home-based approach where they partnered directly with a market and distributed within a 3-mile radius. And the other one was a kind of a mothership approach where it would be a larger truck that had several of these devices and would go to areas where there are several deliveries to be made, and the robots would go make the delivery and come back to that mothership. The other project that we've been working on is with Kiwibot. And with Kiwibot, they were originally brought on board to help in the Warner Center to give people an option to order lunch without having to spend their entire lunch period driving to and from picking up lunch. Again, the pandemic kicked off, so we ended up working with Kiwibot, or we've been working with Kiwibot over the last year and a half on a different strategy. We kind of met with the Kiwibot team, talked to public agency partners and wondered, well, if there's all these sensors and cameras on these devices, what other benefit could they bring while making their deliveries? So over the last year and a half, we've been working to develop the coding necessary for these devices to, as they're delivering, to do data collection on sidewalk assets. You may be surprised to hear that the City of Los Angeles does not have a comprehensive asset database of sidewalk assets, be it benches, trash cans, tree wells, and of course, where maintenance might be needed. So over the last year and a half, we've been working with Streets LA very closely and coming up with LADOT as well to think about what are the different attributes that should be collected and how can that data be used to inform either where future investments go or where maintenance should be tackled or prioritized. Streets LA is very interested in this idea or in testing this capability, as they are still working through some of the legal challenges from the 2016 lawsuit that called out city sidewalks as being ADA. We're also working in the curb management space. I think the scooters and TNCs and other shared mobility devices have really highlighted the need for an increased demand from how we manage curb space. There's also increased deliveries every day. So curb space is really being used for uses beyond transit pickups and drop-offs, as well as parking. But how do we manage that curb effectively without data? We've been working with 2 pilot projects. The first one is a project with IBI's CurbIQ team. CurbIQ is a tool that IBI has developed to collect the data and digitize the sidewalk regulations, or rather the curbside regulations. Again, City of Los Angeles, most cities don't have a digital or a comprehensive inventory of their sidewalk or curb regulations, which includes posted signage and painted curbs, which makes it hard to manage the curb, especially in a downtown area or along a commercial corridor. I'm going to actually drop a link in the chat as we're running low on time, but you can download the full report for this case study. Essentially, what we did was we tested the technology of CurbIQ to be able to understand the competency in being able to create a digital twin of curbside regulations in Los Angeles. We tested it in 4 different urban contexts, ranging from the Fashion District of downtown, the Warner Center, Hollywood, which has some of the most chaotic sidewalks in the city, as well as Maywood, which is a little bit more suburban. The findings were that the tool works very effectively in low to medium density areas, but GIS or GPS issues really kind of come to light during in high density areas like downtown. However, the report identifies how potential solutions to move forward and how cities might be able to utilize this data. And most importantly, the data was about 97% accurate in terms of data collection and transcribing into a digital image. The other company we're working with is Automotus, and they use video analytics to understand what is happening on the curb. We are currently working with them on a pilot to help support LADOT zero emission delivery zones to understand who is using those spaces. The goal is to understand what the compliance is. Are the zero emission delivery zones actually being used by zero emission vehicles? And we're also working to understand how this technology could help facilitate pricing commercial loading zones, right? So today, there is no pricing of commercial loading or unloading zones. A lot of the FedEx and the large commercial fleets, set aside a budget, assuming that they're going to get cited X amount of times, and the city also doesn't have a very steady revenue stream from this use case. Having a price curve for commercial loading and unloading would allow for the city to have a better understanding of the use of the curb, as well as a steadier revenue flow, and the companies would also have a better understanding of how much it costs to do business. So that's where we're at with that project. You can find a little bit more about that project on our website as well. And lastly, my colleague, who is a 20-year Air Force veteran, leads our work on urban air mobility. Mayor Garcetti launched the Urban Air Mobility Partnership here in Los Angeles about 2 years ago, and my colleague Clint Harper has really spearheaded this work. We are really working to better understand what this technology is and what the implications are for urban environments. I think if you had asked me a year and a half ago about urban air mobility, I would have rolled my eyes. But it's impressive how much money the industry is putting towards this effort and towards developing these technologies. Our role has been facilitating conversations between industry partners and different agencies in the city to get an understanding of what local policymakers can do to guide this technology, especially since aviation is a space that has often been managed primarily at the federal and state level. The promise of urban air mobility is that there will be potential use cases within an urban environment, which gives the city a pretty significant role to play, especially when it comes to determining whether these devices or these vehicles would be operational or not in the city, and if so, where they should operate and where facilities to facilitate takeoff and landings. Then a couple of things to tease out. This year, we're working on identifying a couple of a couple of companies that we can partner with to pilot projects on roadway safety via technologies to facilitate new or behavior changes or encourage safer driving. Also coming up in a few weeks is a UAM integration manual, which will kind of highlight the work of Clint Harper, our UAM fellow in the first year, with what we're calling a flight plan as a play on words that kind of identifies how a local jurisdiction can get involved and perhaps should get involved in understanding what urban air mobility might mean for their city or jurisdiction and how they can get ahead of the curve in terms of planning and development policy. And then lastly, as I know this is a TDM focused group, but we are also working with TDM project partners in the near future. We're hoping to be piloting a software tool that helps TMOs for large campuses manage TDM at a higher level. So right now, TMOs for individual companies are charged with providing their own data. The tool we're looking to test is, could there be a tool that kind of aggregates all the different resources in a district or within a campus, and then use that as a way to, kind of like shared parking, share resources, and hopefully see greater efficiencies in the use of TDM strategies. And with that, I thank the SCAG team for letting me speak. I apologize. I'm sure it's a little loud in the venue that I'm at. So thank you for your time, and happy to take any questions either via email or.
Rogelio, thank you so much for this great presentation. And I just want to give an opportunity for anyone who wants to unmute themselves and ask any question about Rogelio's presentation or some of the discussion we had earlier to just do it now. We have a few minutes for question time. So if there's anything we can clarify, and Leslie, anything coming from the chat?
Let's see, we've got Gerald, who's joined us before, and let's see, if I think, as I said, if you just would like to unmute your mic at this point, because we'd like to foster some discussion. So Gerald, if your mic is working, let us know and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I'm happy to unmute myself. How's everybody doing? Thank you all for a wonderful presentation. My question was about the Kiwibots. I'm just curious, how often do you have problems with those in the community, getting knocked over? Are they able to write themselves? Do you have to send a team out to take care of that? Or are they really not meant for that environment?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting standpoint, or interesting question. I would anticipate they're going to get knocked out plenty. I've only seen Focos in my neighborhood, and Kiwibot currently is not operating with autonomously. They are, I think, a case study that I can share is, or that is applicable, is that they are active at LMU's campus. And what I have heard from colleagues or the folks at Kiwibot, as well as a buddy of mine who works on the campus, is that apparently the students like to bring them into their dorm room and mess with them. Eventually, they're returned. Sometimes they have to ask an RA to come out and release the robot. But I think that's something Kiwibot is working on. I believe they have the technology to right side themselves. And currently, the way they're being operated is with kind of what they call, Kiwibot calls an angel guide or guardian angel, which is somebody that is walking behind them with a remote control should anything go right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rogelio, and again, good to see you. We worked on some other projects, and it's a good piggyback question here that Bryce has. So Bryce, go ahead and unmute your mic about your question on the bots.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. All right. So when I was in Pittsburgh, there were some interactions that the side they were different from the Kiwibots, but they were a similar concept where you'd have this autonomous small vehicle that would deliver food to people within the dorms. And then there was one particular interaction that I knew kind of got into the news where the bot either broke down or had an issue climbing the sidewalk ramp, which forced someone in a wheelchair to basically move onto the road in order to avoid them. So I was wondering if there had been any greater discussion surrounding how they interact with people who have mobility issues, how we avoid potential ADA issues with those sorts of things. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, that's definitely something that's top of mind. Currently, Kiwibot has developed or taught the robots to stay out of the way of people. So they will actually drive themselves onto the street if there's a busy sidewalk, and not onto the street, they'd actually be on the gutter or along the curb where feasible. I can only speak to Pittsburgh and Florida as potential case study examples. I know they've been developing some regulations at the state level dictating how large these devices can be and operate on the sidewalk. I think partially because of those big concerns The policy in Florida and Pittsburgh actually allow for vehicles to be significantly larger than the Kiwibot. So I anticipate that there's going to be more challenges, like, unfortunately, in the ADA side in those states. And I think we are, I think that's something we're definitely having conversations on, but we don't have the real test case experience yet, since the vehicles haven't been operating autonomously very long.
Before we go to the next question, sorry, Leslie, it is 11:30 now. So for anyone who has to jump to that next meeting, thank you so much for joining us. You'll see that a survey is going to be sent to you, as well as the slide and a feedback survey, as mentioned, and the worksheets. So expect an email from us. For those who can stay for, continuing just a bit, the Q&A, Leslie, please go ahead with the next question.
Right, so this question will be for you as part of the project team, and it's a little bit more about the mobility hubs, which we've been working on, and I'll let Barbara open her mic to ask the question about the mobility wallets.
Great, thank you. So I was just curious if you could share any information about any work y'all have done about mobility wallets as part of mobility hubs or shared mobility and transit integration projects.
Barbara, what exactly are you interested in? Is it how it is designed, or do you have like any specific question within it?
I only know of 2 case studies that I've personally experienced. So the Clipper card in the Bay Area, and then the Hop card in Portland, Oregon. So if there's any other examples or background information that you have about this type of seamless payment system, that'd be really useful, so we can figure out how to broaden it in the LA region with TAP, for example.
Yeah, and these are some of the examples I had in my mind as well. So one thing I can do, Barbara, is on the side, I want to appreciate, obviously, we over time, but on a side email, I'll be happy to share with you some example that I think can be considered as best practice right now. But key elements to think about mobility wallets is how to design them. I think it's really like the most difficult part of it. A lot of transit agencies obviously have currently cards that they use, and basically the integration of new mobility services within them is a contract process, to just name that, and a back office IT process as well. So there is example in the US where things have been done in a nice way, and not only you have and either are being done by the transit agencies, or there's also private sector led type of mobility wallets, as we might have seen, or you can consider, I guess, the MaaS API Uber partnership recently, or the Lyft one as well recently. And for Uber, also the integration of taxi. In Europe, this practice has been done for more time, and I think Helsinki is really leading the way from a public sector point of view. But personally, on actually working on a mobility wallet project in Switzerland, it took us a lot of stakeholder engagements at the beginning to understand what are the IT consideration requirements and constraint, figure out what type of fare we could integrate, how to include incentive, and how and who will be able to monitor the impact of it. But I know that as of now, the current mobility wallet in Switzerland is a national one with access to ski station on top of transportation. But Barbara, I'll be happy to share more example with you separately.
Great, thanks. This was really helpful as well.
Of course.
Great, and Alio, we have one last question. Dr. Rafi, if you would open your mic and feel free to share your inquiry.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the very thoughtful training that you guys put together. It was very interesting. And my question will be, maybe I don't need an answer, or maybe a direction, but we're talking about mobility in hubs and more often urbanized places. At the center that I work in is the Leonard Transportation Center, and we look to create these hubs in more suburban areas. And I don't know what are the thoughts or if you guys have ever thought of any ideas that you can share in order to help us more understand things here, how in SB and Riverside we can think of these ideas, because as you know that people here are also in need of these sort of mobility choices. And thank you.
This is a really good question. Thank you so much for your feedback on that. And Warren, are you still on the call? Because I might pick your brain on that.
Yes, Warren is still with us. So Warren, you can open your mic.
This is great. I will start, and Warren, I would love to have your feedback.
Oh, wait, let's see. Where did-
If he's still around. When you think about mobility apps, most of the time you think about them, especially in the US, as part of a network. So one of the first things, and I'm mentioning Warren because we're currently working on a mobility app strategy for OCTA, is you want to do, and when you want to think about a potential demand plan, where would mobility app make sense, taking into a variety of factors. And what you will see, and this is something that we're currently working on, as I mentioned, is obviously there is natural type of hubs, right? The one that are in a very dense urban center, but there is a hierarchy of mobility app that can exist. Not every mobility app needs to be, by an app truck station with all the fancy lockers, etc. Some mobility apps can be in a bus shelter in a low dense area. They can be neighborhood center. They can be your neighborhood place to be and to gather to then access the more regional sector. So I do know that in the mobility app strategy we're currently working with OCTA, we are taking into account low dense suburban areas as well as potential areas where mobility app would make sense, as it's not just about what the potential data analysis is showing you, it's also what the stakeholder wants to see. Why do they want them? And another perspective on that is some mobility apps can be physical, some can be but can be optional and can be implemented or removed depending on specific time of the year or specific events. So it is absolutely taking into account in how we think about mobility app, especially when we have an equity approach about this. But yes, if someone from OCTA is here to share a bit more, love to let them.
Warren has unmuted his mic and he appears to still be here. So go ahead, Warren.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think, I think you might have mentioned this earlier, Alia, that, a lot of it is asking almost the priority questions up front and how important that is, almost setting mobility hubs can solve so many issues. It's like this Swiss Army knife type of tool. It can do a heck of a lot of different things. And so then trying to figure out how you would like to utilize that tool for the locality. So, when we're looking at OCTA, for instance, what a mobility hub might mean for Central County or North County, which is much more urban, much better high quality transit, where it may even connect into Metrolink or the OC streetcar once that's open and ready for use, versus in a much denser environment, versus in South County that probably reflects more of the dynamics for a lot of the Inland Empire, where it's pretty much a car-dominated infrastructure. It's there. It may be less about how it is the first mile, last mile on transit, and it may even be partly how it kind of replaces what otherwise might have been a transit trip. And then, when you then are doing the overlay to equity, how does this, help achieve that, if you have kind of mobility limitations or access limitations for whatever reason, does the mobility hub in combination with micro mobility, micro transit, what other services that may be in the mix help to kind of bridge that gap. So I don't know if that kind of helped, but I think there's so many different pieces that you need to start to think about how they all fit together. And then how does that achieve these kind of larger objectives?
Thank you so much, Warren. Really appreciate your input here.
Yes, thank you, Warren. And before I hand it back to our project team, I'm going to do a shameless plug and say that our next session is going to talk about suburban and rural TDM. And Dr. Raffi, we've invited some folks from IE Commuter to discuss some of the things they've done, and we'll also refer back to SCAG's TDM plan to talk about what we've looked at in suburban and rural areas, in particular the Inland Empire. So we invite you and everybody else to join us in our next deep dive session. And so with that, again, back to Alia.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone who actually stayed with us for these extra minutes of Q&A. We'll obviously look at the chat, and if there's any remaining question we were not able to cover today, I'll make sure that I respond back to all of them after this call. Thanks again to Rogelio for joining us and presenting the very interesting project he's working on. I think seeing the actionable example out of the theory and the concept is always a good way to move forward. So as I was saying, wrapping up now, we really appreciate the time you were able to save for us today. Our next step here, as mentioned, is to send you an email with a couple of things, the slides, the toolkit worksheets, and a feedback survey. I believe that maybe the survey link has been also shared in the chat. I don't know if it has been,
Yes.
and great,
Yes,
that's amazing. That's amazing. I don't have the chat open, so I don't know.
Survey Monkey is in the chat, and
Perfect.
we'll also be following up with email, so you'll be able to contact us that way.
That's really great. I wanted to thanks again, SCAG for having us, Leslie for being an amazing facilitator, co-facilitator, I'd say, Rogelio, as I mentioned. And yes, if you have more questions, as you can see, it's a complex world, but there is a lot of interesting initiatives that are going on. So happy to have further chats about this. Have a nice day. Bye, everyone.